The Department for International Trade has announced a new developing countries trading scheme, slashing trade barriers to some of the poorest countries in the world. Having left the European Union and, crucially, the EU customs union too, the UK is now able to set its own terms of trade with the world. That doesn't just mean bilateral trade deals, as we've seen with Japan, Australia and New Zealand, but it too allows the UK to institute blanket new trade terms to less developed countries. Now, the EU ran a fairly generous scheme in this area known as Anything But Arms, but this week the UK has announced it's going further, building on that programme, bringing new countries into this new, more generous scheme, meaning not only cheaper goods to be imported to the UK from those countries, but also this policy is deeply humanitarian, worth tens of millions of pounds to developing countries now and perhaps hundreds of millions by the end of the decade. Well, is this a fairly unique thing in politics, a win-win policy, something which means we can provide to the poorest and actually get cheaper stuff too? Well, I'm joined now by Ian Mitchell, Senior Policy Fellow and Co-Director, Europe for the Centre for Global Development. Thank you for joining us this morning. And first of all, what are the changes here between the scheme that we operated under the European Union versus this new scheme that has just been announced this week?
Good morning, Tom. Yeah, so it is, and as you said, an improvement on the EU scheme, and I think there are probably three parts to that improvement. The first one is that a greater number of goods will qualify for zero tariffs. So under the EU scheme, it was 80%. The new UK scheme, it's 85%. I think a second dimension is that there are a broader group of countries that qualify. So 8 new countries will qualify for lower tariffs. And then there are a group of simplifications, and that's the third thing. So the government has removed some very low tariffs that are called nuisance tariffs. It's removed some seasonal tariffs, and it's made the process for achieving those lower tariffs for the countries easier and simpler.
Now, there were some preclusions within the European scheme, meaning that if some of these developing countries didn't meet all of their global obligations, didn't sign up to some international treaties or weren't following through with those, then the favourable terms of trade would be dropped. In this new UK scheme, that sort of automatic process has changed. How so?
Yeah, that's right. So the government's moved from a system to where you expect countries to have signed up to international conventions before they qualify for the reduced tariffs, to one where qualifying for the tariffs only depends on economic vulnerability. And as in the previous scheme, ministers and the government retain discretion over whether countries can get those reductions. So if they are egregiously or systematically in breach of international conventions, then the government can withdraw the tariffs. They've also broadened the areas where they can withdraw those preferences. So they had already been on labour rights, for example, but they've been extended to anti-corruption and also to climate issues and some other international issues where ministers want to maintain discretion. So it'll be interesting to see, for example, when in principle Syria qualifies for the new lower tariffs, but I think the government and most people have very serious concerns about the Syrian regime, and it will be interesting to see how ministers deal with Syria in principle qualifying for the new regime.
There's a greater deal of discretion for UK ministers in terms of who this applies to, I suppose. Just finally in this conversation, what does this mean for British consumers? Are we going to see cheaper goods coming in as well as helping these developing countries?
Yes, we will. And I think it's, you alluded to this at your introductory remarks. I mean, I think trade tariffs and frictions are unhelpful to both sides. And so if you can reduce them without damaging your own industry disproportionately or by giving away negotiating capital for trade deals, then removing them makes sense to both sides. And so in this case, I mean, these changes are relatively incremental for UK consumers, but they're moving in the right direction. So imports will be cheaper, and it will make a small contribution to bringing down inflation.